mainstream's Forum on Religious Freedom. My name is Aaron Roberts, and I am the pastor of Colonial Church, the building that you happen to be sitting in right now, and I'm also going to be your moderator for this evening. Tonight, our event on religious freedom begins with a central conviction. And that conviction is that the foundational decision that these United States made at its inception, that we must exist without any establishment of religion, be it Christianity, Judaism, Hindu, Islam, any established religion, is paramount. At the same time, not interfering with any religion's right to exercise their faith publicly is also inherent in our First Amendment. We often call it the separation of church and state, but probably more rightly in today's pluralistic society, we refer to that as a separation of religion and government. Because of our nation's non-establishment of religion, we stand apart from thousands of years of traditional governments that for cultures around the world where religion and government were not separate. So it's not surprising that this idea of separation is misunderstood and even opposed by some. Mainstream holds that it is this separation that ensures the freedom of religion from coercion and government from theocratic views. We are living in a time of rapid change in the religious landscape of America, and tonight we have three panelists who have experienced some of the ways in which religious freedom and expression have been legislated against, and the espousing of theocratic notions of government that are desired by a few. And our panel tonight is Vickie Stangl, who is here from the Americans United for Separation of Church and State, Holly Weatherford on this side from the American Civil Liberties Union, and Micheline Berger, who is on the Mainstream board. Our panelists this evening are going to have 5 minutes to tell them a little bit about themselves, their organization, and give some opening remarks. And then I'm going to be moderating a short panel discussion of questions that they often find misunderstood on the subject of separation of religion and government. And then most importantly tonight, we want to hear from you. What is your perspective of the issues of religious freedom, both here in Kansas nationally, and also have an opportunity to be asking our panel questions that you may have as well. So let's begin. Micheline.
Thank you. My name is Micheline Berger, and I'm the immediate past president of Mainstream Coalition. The Mainstream Coalition, of course, was founded on the principles of separation of church and state and advocacy for strong public education. Separation of church and state is what we're gathered here tonight to discuss. Anti-God, immoral, anti-religion, thin-skinned, troublemaker, too easily offended, unchristian, religious bigot, just get over it, anti-majority rule, undemocratic, un-American. That's just a short list of terms that I have personally heard when I try to talk to people about the issue of separation of church and state. And frankly, even with some mainstream members. Now, first, my disclaimer. I'm not an expert on U.S. constitutional law, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express. Well, maybe a little more than that. I have practiced law here in Johnson County for the past 37 years, and I've read and studied the U.S. Constitution, and I have a bachelor's degree in history. I've read the Bill of Rights, and I've read numerous other writings, including a number of court decisions, including important Supreme Court decisions that deal with the issue of separation of church and state. I don't pretend to be an expert on the subject, but I know enough to have grown a backbone to be able to tell people who are frankly religious bigots that you don't know what you're talking about when you tell me the separation of church and state doesn't exist. And so that's what we're here trying to do tonight, is to have a conversation about what separation of church and state is, where did it come from, and why it matters to us. First of all, separation of church and state comes from the United States Constitution. Now, I'm sick and tired of hearing this. It's not in the Constitution. The Constitution doesn't say one word about this being a Christian nation, doesn't say one word about this country is built on the Ten Commandments. It doesn't say one word about this country being based on the Bible. Nothing. What it says is that in the actual body of the Constitution, there will be no religious test for serving in an office in the government. Then, that was in 1787. Very shortly thereafter, the signers of the Constitution said, well, we need to do a few other things. That was called the Bill of Rights. That was 2 years later that the Bill of Rights were enacted. The very first amendment, and it is important that it is the First Amendment, which was approved in 1789, says, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. There it is. Now, I'll say something about amendments as an attorney. A lot of times a law is written, and then amendments come. When amendments come, it changes the original thing. It becomes part of the original thing. It's not like some little tidbit hanging out there in the netherworld. It becomes an integral part of that document. So it's there. It's in our Constitution. Then, fast forward some 75 years, 1868, the 14th Amendment came along. Prior to this time, a lot of the states in the country had said, well, yeah, we know that religion and government need to be separate, but that's for the federal government. It doesn't really apply here in Mississippi, it doesn't apply in Louisiana, it doesn't apply in Florida. We can do our own thing. And they did. They did. And terrible persecution resulted. I mean, we all know about the episodes of persecution in this country, but they go way, way back. Way, way back in the 1700s, the Baptists were persecuted. The Anabaptists were persecuted by the Baptists. The Catholics were persecuted by everybody. The Quakers were persecuted. The Congregationalists were persecuted. The Anglicans, the Dutch Protestants. You make the list. And I haven't even talked about the Jews. They were absolutely persecuted too. It was rampant. So when the signers of the Constitution got together, they said, we've got so much disagreement about religion in these states, in these colonies, we can't decide what religion should be the best one, or the most important one, or maybe none at all, because not all the founders were Christians. That certainly was the majority religion, but some of them were not. But in any event, they said, let's make the Constitution neutral, which they did. Well, in 1868, the 14th Amendment came along, and very clearly the 14th Amendment says, all of these other provisions of the Constitution are now going to apply to the states. So you folks in Mississippi and Louisiana, you can't wiggle out of these things anymore. You have to do the same thing. And so I wanted to start off this discussion by reminding everybody that that's the basis for this doctrine of separation of church and state. And it's a part of the U.S. Constitution. And I'd say everybody here needs to grow a backbone too, and never, never, never let anybody tell you, well, it's not in the Constitution.
I am currently the president of an affiliate of a national organization in Washington, D.C. called Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. Our chapter is called the Great Plains chapter of AU. And I have to tell you why this chapter was formed. You all know in 2009, a terrible thing occurred in Wichita. Dr. George Tiller was shot and killed. And that was my epiphany, if you will, where I decided it was time to come out of the shadows and really stand up and fight for the things I believe in. And I believe in, more than anything, the separation of church and state. And why do I believe that? Well, in my opinion, it was the religious extremists who caused the death of Dr. Tiller. They're also the root cause of so many regressive bills against women's health. And also, in my opinion, they have a concerted effort to usurp the freedom of conscience of all Americans when they denigrate the separation of church and state in this country. Now, saying all this, Wichita has good and bad people like every community. But I have to tell you, Wichita is not a very pro-family or pro-choice town. And it's especially unfriendly when it comes to anyone upsetting the status quo of religious authority. And if you are a member of the government there, or you have a business, or whatever social network you belong to, the unifying link to all of these groups is through their religion. So you can imagine when this new organization came to town, how we were treated. One of the first things that we decided to do was to challenge the Wichita City Council's invocations. They happened to be highly sectarian. Many prayers said to Lord Jesus Christ. And we believe that there are many other people with other faiths or no faiths, and it wasn't a good place to be making these prayers. So I went before the city council and basically told them that. And right away, many city council members became very upset. They took it as a personal affront that I was challenging their faith. And they weren't listening to what I was saying, that indeed they can pray as much as they want, they can pray before council meetings. I was just asking for a moment of silence. I wasn't even asking them to totally get rid of invocations. But they were very upset with me. And when the one city council member decided to tell me that church and state was a myth, well, I taught political science for 9 years at Wichita State University, and I've got my textbooks here that I've taught from, and I immediately wanted to respond, and they said, "Little lady, you don't get to say anymore." This was I admit, I was only supposed to be giving a comment and not remarking, but that one was hard to not remark about. But it showed me very clearly that what we are up against is this idea that you're threatening my religion. You're wanting to take my religion away from me. And that's how the majority feels, because it's been a privilege all these years to be in the majority and to have your faith everywhere and anywhere and not care about the minority's views or beliefs, because you didn't have to care. And then when AU was formed in 1947, it wasn't the atheists, it wasn't the agnostics bringing suit, it was the Catholics, the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Jews, who were upset that their children were having to say Protestant prayers in public schools. Those were the groups bringing suit. And so AU formed to assist those parents, and that's where AU has evolved, and we've tried very hard ever since to be at the forefront of this issue, educating the public, but we're losing ground. And I just want to give you an example of this. When I was teaching at Wichita State, each semester got a little worse. Each semester there were more and more students coming to class absolutely convinced that church and state was a myth, that the Constitution had God in it, and that the Constitution was in fact based upon the Ten Commandments. When I taught that very differently than what they expected, they wanted to debate the issue. You don't debate facts. And so obviously we had some upset people. I actually had a young lady who cried in class. She was so certain God was in the Constitution. And why did she think that? Because she recalled in her mind, and she told me this later, but when the president says his oath of office, he says at the end, "So help me God." Well, if you turn to your Constitution, that's not in the Constitution, right? That was ad-libbed by George Washington. And Some presidents have chosen to add that, others have chosen not to add that. So she was convinced God was in the Constitution. Now let me tell you, we the people, this is what the students would read in the textbook. Textbooks do include the separation of church and state. It says, and I quote, "The Establishment Clause has been interpreted quite strictly to mean that a virtual wall of separation exists between church and state. The separation of church and state was especially important to the great numbers of American colonists who had sought refuge from persecution for having rejected membership in state-sponsored churches. I have a feeling, however, that there are many students in Kansas that are not being taught about the separation of church and state." Now, Madison, of course you know, James Madison was the father of the Constitution. And he would never have given religion carte blanche over the government. So when we have legislators say it's a one-way street, it only means government has to stay out of religion. That's not at all what it means. It means the government has to take a neutral stance, but it also cannot uphold a religion or a religion.
The ACLU works every day in our courts, our legislature, and our communities to promote and protect our constitutional right to religious freedom. Locally, we've had many issues in terms of litigation dealing with separation of religion and government in our public schools, in our municipalities and their governing functions. In the legislature, I've been the lobbyist now for ACLU, I think for 3 years. And religious freedom was not something that I was working on frequently in the legislature until the introduction of the Kansas Preservation of Religious Freedom Act. And we'll get to that a little bit later. But that was really one of the dominant issues that I've dealt with over the last 3 years. That bill was filed in response to the city of Manhattan, including protections for sexual orientation and gender identity into their non-discrimination ordinance. Other issues included bills that provided or laws that provided conscience protections for physicians and other medical professionals related to the provision of abortions. And this year, we've really seen an effort sort of percolating at the federal level, trickling down into our states and our local levels, that's sort of mounting an aggressive religious freedom movement. And I thought, you know, what brought us here? This is definitely going to become one of my priority issues in the legislature. And how did we get here? And I think Vickie put it perfect when she said that people feel like their religious freedom is being taken away. So this past June, I attended a large rally in Topeka that was held by the Conference of Catholic Bishops in Topeka in response to Obamacare and the HHS contraception rule, and they had called it the Fortnight for Freedom. There were almost 1,000 people in attendance. It was over 100 degrees outside. And it became very clear to me that this religious freedom that they were fighting for was very narrow. It wasn't the religious freedom that I know as an advocate for the ACLU. The comments were focused primarily on abortion and birth control. And so that gave me a picture into what sort of issues we might be dealing with in the next legislative session. So here we are. We continue in religious freedom hearings that deal with a number of issues, religious freedom related hearings that deal with a number of issues. We still hear them talking about Obamacare and needing to protect employers in churches from the HHS contraception rule. And a lot of that is either smoke and mirrors or red herrings, and we're sort of avoiding talking about the true issue at hand, which I believe is making a decision about whether we're going to promote religious freedom for all, those that choose to practice their personal faith or no faith at all, or are we narrowing the scope and promoting religious freedom for a few of a certain religious persuasion. Here in a little bit, we'll continue on with the program, and I will offer a legislative update and bring you up to speed on what's happening in the legislative session. We're nearing the end of our general session, and so a lot of stuff is happening, and we'll talk about what religious freedom bills are moving, where they are in the process, and what other religiously motivated bills and efforts are also occurring at the state level.
Tonight we're going to be having a panel conversation of questions that our panelists find that are often misunderstood on the subject of the separation of religion and government. And I'm going to be moderating each panel's response, and not to be a time Nazi, but I'm trying to, so that we all have time for our questions later on, to keep our responses to 2 minutes, and I'll give you a little warning as those things start approaching. We're going to start tonight with a question from Micheline. A Kansas legislator, keep touching the screen funny. Kansas legislator testified this year that religious freedom means that government can't intrude on religion, but it doesn't keep religion from intruding on government. What is your response to this assertion, and what laws do we have in this country to promote and protect religious freedom?
I can answer the first part of that pretty briefly. That the assertion that separation of church and state is a one-way street is absurd. And I don't have any other way of answering that question. The first thing that I would ask of anyone who makes that suggestion is, where's your authority for that? Can you cite a single bit in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights, in any of the amendments, in any of the case law that underlies separation of church and state that supports that? There's none. There's nothing out there. It's an invention. It's a fabrication. And if you think about it, it's a circular, absurd argument. Because if you say, okay, religion cannot intrude, government cannot intrude into religion, but religion can intrude into government. Okay, think about this. That means that, let's say you're a Pentecostal, and the government cannot tell you as a Pentecostal what to do, but you as a Pentecostal can go into government, and you can rewrite government so that all the Pentecostals are promoted and everybody else is relegated to the hinterlands. What have you just done? You have now made government into a theocracy, which then basically promotes that particular religion. And so it's a stupid circular argument. It goes nowhere. And it's the kind of thing where it's part of this package of disinformation to try to get people to think that separation of church and state is not what it is. And it's not directly related to this question, but somewhat. I'm really sick and tired of religious zealots usurping the term religious freedom. They've hijacked it to mean they want their religion promoted and protected, and they want you to shut up. And that's not religious freedom. And I'll say again that I think we need to grow a backbone and say we're not going to accept that outlook. Now let me just talk for a moment about
You're 2 minutes.
Okay, but you asked the other question about what laws or do we have that protect. What was the question? What laws do we have that protect religious freedom? And I'm just going to very briefly say, first and foremost, we have the Constitution and the Bill of Rights that protect us. Then we have a body of case law going back to the late 1700s up to this very day that outline the parameters of religious freedom, dealing with things like school prayer, with religious garb, with religious displays. And you may think, well, that's not really religious freedom because that's telling people they can't exercise their religion. Wrong. It is religious freedom. If I get to do something and you get to do something, we are free. If I'm the only one who gets to do something and you can't, we are not free. And that's the difference. I can talk about specific cases if you're interested later on, but I'm afraid everybody will go to sleep.
The next question, and this question is for all of you. How do you respond to claims that the religion government separation, however you refer to it, church-state separation, is anti-religious.
The charge of being anti-religious, I think, is used to arouse negative emotions and scare and inflame people. And so whenever I hear that particular usage of being anti-religious, I think it's, again, trying to just, get to the heart of you or of citizens not wanting to move beyond thinking about, well, if I don't believe in this religion, should it have as much impact as my majority religion does? And I think that's what we have to get beyond. And I also would like to just, I've got a note here. I think most of us in this room agree that nothing is more important than our happiness and well-being to live in a nation that respects freedom of conscience. But we have to respect the rights and the conscience, freedom of conscience of the minority. And I would just say one more thing about that. I know the time's ticking down. Madison put together a constitution that did protect minority rights. He was very concerned about majority misrule. And if you look at our Constitution, there are ample examples of how the minority is protected. We have minority, if you look at the president, he can veto, one person can veto all of Congress. Or we have 9 people on the Supreme Court who can, decide what's constitutional. So we do have a minority rights system set up in our Constitution. We don't just have a majority rule in America. We have a protection for minority as well. And so I just want to make that point very clear.
I think my response generally has been that it's not anti-religion, that it's pro-religion, and that the work to respect the separation between church and state or to promote religious freedom is to ensure that people of all faiths or of no faith at all can practice their religion or belief freely without government interference or influence. And that is what makes it pro-religion. The government has no business being a religion, and so we want to ensure that the religious communities or those that, without any faith persuasion, are free to, do so at will, and not be forced into, like Vickie said, which has come up in the legislature, school prayer, not be forced into praying a Protestant prayer if they are of the Catholic persuasion or if they are Jewish. And so again, it's pro-religion. We're working to make sure that government is not interfering in one's faith or belief system.
When our government was formed, and I talk about the founders as if they're a monolithic group, and they are not. They were men of very, very different opinions and persuasions. But they did come together in saying that this government was going to be neutral on matters of religion, and many of them were quite religious men. And those people who were very, very religious, in fact, came in their writings, you can see this, they said that they believed that the marketplace of ideas would strengthen religious convictions. That a church that needed to have the government prop it up wasn't worth much. And there's a lot to be said for that attitude. The other thing that I would like to add is that I think most people in this country, coming from a variety of religious persuasions, do believe that we need to stop oppression, and we need to make sure that other people are not oppressed. And that is the huge responsibility in a democracy, too, that the majority takes its obligation to protect minorities extremely seriously. And churches promote that. And so this whole idea of separating government and religion is a pro-religious position.
Our next question is for you, Vickie. Some people claim that the U.S. is a Christian nation. If the majority of people claim to be Christian, why shouldn't they get to say which religion is promoted and practiced?
Well, first of all, what we have to remember is that the United States is a democratic republic. We have a secular government, but culturally, many Americans are Christian. Those are two very different animals. Now, if there ever was a time that the founders could have established a Christian nation, their time was in 1787. In fact, there were delegates very upset that there was no call about affirmations or giving God credit for this new government and setting that up within the Constitution. But as Micheline has said several times, the founders very much rejected putting God into the Constitution and creating a theocratic or Christian state. They could have. There were calls to do that in the delegate ratification of the Constitution, but it didn't pan out that way. So we have to understand we have a secular government, but culturally we have a Christian community, a majority of Christians here in the United States. The other thing that I would like to say again, and this is a point, and I wanted to make sure I had this down, where they bring up the fact that all our laws are based on the Bible or some Ten Commandments. There was a case, very famous Supreme Court case by, it was called Abington School District versus Schimpf, and this is what Justice Welch said about this idea that we have a Christian nation. He said, quote, "Those who make this assertion can hardly be serious. If Christianity is the law of the state, adequate penalties must be provided to enforce obedience to all its precepts. No one seriously contends for any such doctrine in this country, or, might I almost say, in this age of the world." So that is always my response to Are We a Christian Nation?
This is a question that you all wanted to respond to. It was once a common practice to say the Lord's Prayer, Christian Lord's Prayer, in school every morning, and that's no longer practiced today. But are kids allowed to pray in school today? And if so, how do policymakers attempt to legislate the issue in Kansas?
The short answer is yes, children can pray in schools. They can pray all day long, silently, at any time they choose. They just cannot interrupt or interfere the school day, and they can even be off in a little corner with two others if they'd like. So no, God has not been kicked out of the schools, and children can still pray. We know that teachers and administrators are not allowed to lead these kind of prayers. That's been decided by Stangl versus Bartel. I would like to just say about the Lord's Prayer, I grew up in a school system where we had a teacher who every day had the daily word. And my little ears pricked up because I was told we weren't supposed to talk about religion in school. That's what my parents had told me. And I knew very well that that daily word was a religious type of sentiment we were asked to read. The teacher was very clever. She knew the law. She did not read that. She passed it down to each student in the aisle, and I dreaded the day it was going to come to me, because it did come to me, because the students who didn't want to read the daily word were then ostracized by the teacher. She would punish us. I would have to stay in from recess, do the dishes, whatever. And so that's what happened to me. So as far as the Lord's Prayer, this comes from the idea back in the 19th century of should public schools be also in charge of teaching children morals? And that debate went back and forth, and they thought at that time, yes, the schools should be teaching children morals. Let's have them say the Lord's Prayer. But I can tell you after the daily word that this affects students. It makes people uncomfortable, and the court has ruled that this kind of coercive act does violate the Establishment Clause, and that's why we do not say the Lord's Prayer any longer in our public schools.
I've heard this before as well, that I said the Lord's Prayer every day in school when I was in grade school, and it didn't do me any harm. And I've thought about that, and I think that did that person a lot of harm. For one thing, it taught that person intolerance, and that's a big problem. The second thing that's wrong with that is that it made that person feel emboldened because that person was in the majority and did not recognize his responsibility as a person of faith to protect the rights of the minority. And that's a big responsibility. So saying that gives the kid 2 bad lessons. The third thing is, and this is a horrible lesson, is that it teaches that it's okay to marginalize. That it's okay that the little Jewish girl sitting next to you feels like an outsider. That's okay, because you're the majority. And that's not okay. We all know marginalization leads to ostracism, leads to persecution, leads to atrocities. These things don't happen in a vacuum. They take a long time to build, and they start in very, very subtle ways. I think that this child sitting in the grade school needs to know that you don't want to wait until things are horrible before you take note of persecution. You need to start at the outset and learn to respect other people and the rights of minorities. So I think there's a big problem with this. And the Supreme Court has already decided this issue and said we're not going to allow it for essentially the same reasons.
I went to school in Oklahoma and Texas, and our church group would have breakfast meetings at school, and we would, say our prayer and do our Bible studies before school started. The Young Life group, we would do See You at the Pole, and there would be one day a year where we would all meet at the pole and have a student-led prayer. I played basketball, volleyball, softball, attended all the baseball and football games. They all opened with a moment of silence. And it never once, I felt like, prayer was in school. I had my opportunity to pray if I so choose. In the 5th grade is when I sort of had the wake-up call of, oh, okay, wait, we're not doing the prayer like we do it when I go to church Sunday, Wednesday, and other days. And there was a Jehovah's Witness in my class, and there was a Muslim in my class. And it was in the 5th grade, it was the Jehovah's Witness explaining to me why she didn't stand up and do the Pledge of Allegiance and why she didn't participate in the school birthday parties. And it was the Muslim student explaining to me why he didn't participate in the See You at the Pole and the Bible studies, because I just sort of assumed that everyone was like me. And that was sort of my introduction to what Aaron referred to as a pluralistic society. That, okay, we're not all cut from the same cloth, we're not all identical, and these are my friends, and I need to respect them, and I need to make an effort to understand where they're coming from and not stand in judgment of them when they don't do the things that I do or they don't act the way that I act. But why are we continuing to legislate religious freedom? When I've heard it talked about in the legislature this year, I think the intent is genuine and good from some of the legislators who are concerned about overtime, but who are concerned about the violence in schools. They're concerned about bullying in schools, and they feel, coming from their personal faith, that prayer in school might help some of these situations. But like Micheline said, the law stands, and the law is that we can't have school-led or teacher-led prayer, and that the students need to engage in that in their own personal way.
What's the problem with the 10 Commandments hanging in a courtroom? Many of our laws do come from the Bible, don't they?
Okay, I'm going to have to do Micheline here. I'm not an expert. In fact, I'm not even a lawyer. At least she has that. But here's my answer to this, and I had to pull something. So George Carlin, the great comedian, once said, here's the number 1 commandment Americans should follow. Keep thy religion to thyself. My personal view is that the courthouse is not a house of worship. And whether we believe it or not, the 10 Commandments are not the beliefs of every person who walks through that courthouse door. And I personally think that when we're talking about posting the 10 Commandments in a legal situation, it's really just bullies wanting to force their religious beliefs in the public square. And that's really kind of no different than other things. But Thomas Jefferson once answered this question, and so I'm going to try to explain what I would tell my students. Before the colonies, in Great Britain, the Anglo-Saxons had brought over their traditions to the island of Great Britain, and they brought with them something called common law. And this common law predates Christianity to the Isles, to the British Isles. So after, of course, Great Britain Christianized, then there were many other different factors involved with this. But common law, English common law, predates Christianity. But our law is based upon common law. So if you really want to get technical, it's really based on Saxon law. And so that's how he explained that issue about the Ten Commandments and the law. I'd also like to say that common law is known as judge-made law. And this means that when issues were being debated, they would look at past or precedents of some kind to determine how to rule on this particular type of difficulty or dispute between two people. We still do this today in our own system, but our laws are really based upon equity and not morals per se. You know, so if an injustice occurs, we seek redress. Even if someone is murdered, we're not really supposed to be seeking revenge, we're seeking redress. And it's not like morality that religion would be seeking under their laws.
Micheline, this question is for you. Religion can provide an ethical framework for people. It influences relationships and behavior. A government official may be informed and influenced by religion in powerful ways. It is not possible for a person to separate this influence in their work. How can you incorporate that ethical framework that may become at its roots in your religious background to a government policy without religion?
All of us come to our beliefs, our morals, our values, our ethics from different sources. Some of those come from religious sources. Some of them come from the writings of great teachers throughout history. Some of those attitudes come from important people we have met, mentors, experiences we've had. In short, we get our values from a whole host of sources and not just from religion. And I mean this in no way negative toward religion, because religion has been a force for evil, but it has also been a tremendous force for good in shaping people's attitudes toward justice. And we can all applaud the efforts of various faith communities throughout history in trying to make things better. Even in our own time, I recall in the 1960s, the priests and the nuns, the Catholics that protested the Vietnam War, the people of faith, Jewish, Catholic, from all faiths, and I would say atheist groups as well, all working for civil rights in the 1960s. Later on, various religious groups aligning themselves with non-religious groups to fight for women's rights, for nuclear disarmament, for environmental protection, and the list goes on. You all know how faith communities have worked together with people who do not have a religious faith to advance the cause of humanity, to seek to create justice and a better world. And those are wonderful. So I don't believe that myself or other people who believe in the separation of church and state or the Supreme Court decisions that are out there tell anyone to leave your religious, moral, and ethical values at the door when you come to work in government, when you come to legislate or to work as a judge or to serve in an executive capacity. I can remember Jimmy Carter. He's probably the most Baptist of all Baptists. And he, as I understand it, he prayed in the White House every single day, probably more than once. But I never heard him advocate religious dogma. I never heard him say, we have to make sure that my beliefs become the beliefs, become the law of this land. And that's the difference.
We are having a legislative update from Hall Weatherford from the ACLU on what is currently going on in our Kansas State Legislature and where the track was built. I am so sorry about that.
No problem. Provide some context to what we're talking about tonight. So in terms of religious freedom legislation that we're monitoring, and I do work for the ACLU, but I also disclose I'm a member of Maine PAC, so I also am affiliated with the Mainstream Coalition, and I try to keep an eye on stuff from the mainstream perspective as well. So in terms of religious freedom legislation, the bill that is moving quickly through the legislature and soon to be on its way to the governor's desk is the Kansas Preservation of Religious Freedom Act. This is more commonly referred to as Religious Freedom Restoration Act. We do have a federal Religious Freedom Restoration Act that was enacted following a Supreme Court decision. And then another Supreme Court decision left it to the states to enact their own Religious Freedom Restoration Acts. And basically, what these acts do is allow an individual to bring a claim or raise a defense that the government is burdening their religious freedom in some way. The Kansas law reads a little bit differently than the federal law and other state laws that have been enacted in other states that are considering religious freedom legislation. The Kansas law also says that an individual can bring a claim if they believe that they are likely to be burdened by the government. Their religious freedom is likely to be burdened by the government. So it's important to take a step back and look at the history or the evolution of this legislation in Kansas. Like I mentioned earlier, the original bill was filed in response to Manhattan, Kansas, including sexual orientation and gender identity into their non-discrimination ordinance. That bill was defeated the first year in 2011 because the original language specifically targeted those local non-discrimination ordinances and exempted them essentially from any sort of protection of the law. They've taken that out this year, and that's the difference this year than the previous 2 years. The second year in 2012, we heard a lot of testimony about Obamacare and the birth control mandate, and the Kansas Preservation of Religious Freedom Act would somehow protect us from the oppression of Obamacare and the birth control rule. That's not the case. That was smoke and mirrors, and I think a lot of political fodder. They've sort of left that behind, although we still like to talk about that in terms of employers providing birth control for their employees if their religious beliefs conflict with that. But this year, after removing the language that specifically targets those local ordinances, the bill is somewhat better, except that we are really concerned with the fact that it establishes the lowest threshold in the country in terms of when an individual can bring a claim. So as they've removed the language that specifically targets those local non-discrimination ordinances, by establishing this low threshold that an individual who feels like they are likely to be burdened by the government can still raise a claim, we still believe that some of those important local protections are at risk. So for example, in Lawrence, if a landlord is afraid that at some point they might have to rent to somebody who is gay, they could challenge the non-discrimination ordinance in Lawrence under this state law. Another hypothetical that has been raised is in terms of a firefighter. I'm trying to think what a legislator raised in committee. A firefighter, a Muslim firefighter, not wanting to help fight a fire at a Christian church. I mean, do we know if that would actually be? I don't know. But I mean, there's a lot of hypotheticals. There's a lot of uncertainty, and we believe that there's a better way to protect religious freedom. We believe that there are other religious freedom restoration acts, like in Texas, that was signed by Governor George W. Bush, that ensures that there's protections for civil rights laws currently enacted in the state. that ensure that our land use and zoning and historic preservation laws are exempted from these types of challenges and not subject to that. So an example of that would be in your community, if your neighbor would like to open a church in their house, as our law is currently written, they could challenge your zoning ordinance based on the Kansas Preservation of Religious Freedom Act. In Kansas, an individual would not be able to do that because the zoning laws are exempt. I'm running out of time, so I'll keep going. Okay. Again, that bill has passed overwhelmingly and just passed today out of the Senate, and so it will be on the governor's desk very soon.
Which number?
2203. The next bill is religious displays on public property. And this bill is designed to provide clarification about when government entities or public schools can have religious displays on their property. And the bill does say that in terms of religious displays in public schools, for example, that these displays do have to comply with constitutional law. And so it's more devil's in the details. This bill is passed. This bill will become law when it makes it to the governor's desk. But one of our initial concerns in terms of the testimony is that some of what a public school can do has been overstated. And so like I said, the devil's in the details, because then we believe that some of it is our responsibility to make sure that school districts understand what then the Constitution says in terms of their ability to have those religious displays, that they must be academic in nature and not devotional or proselytizing. So again, that one is 2037, religious displays on public property. Another one that popped up is Celebrate Freedom Week. And we're all for celebrating freedom, right? This is the week following Veterans Day, and the intent is that we educate our young people in schools about where, the sacrifices that have been made for their freedom. And so this bill has passed the House. It is in the Senate, but the devil is in the details again. This bill has been enacted in a few other states, the first being Texas. It was put forth by a legislator who's now a former legislator. His name is Rick Green. And he is closely connected to another individual who is behind the curriculum standard changes in Texas that were all in the news, and that mainstream also talked about dealing with their social studies standards. So in terms of the content of Celebrate Freedom Week as it stands now, on the face, it's not objectionable. When you look at the motivation behind it, and you look through Rick Green's suggested curriculum in terms of, our country being founded on the base of Christianity and one nation under God, and what does that mean, so on and so forth. Again, the devil's in the details. We have to watch how this law is implemented. Fortunately, in other states, boards of education have implemented in a neutral way. And so we just want to make sure that Kansas follows suit and implements in a neutral way and does not rely on some of the other curriculum that's promoted by the original bill's sponsor. The next one is the Tax Credit Scholarship Program. Celebrate Freedom Week is 2280. The Tax Credit Scholarship Program is House Bill 2400. This bill recently passed out of the House Education Committee and is on its way to the full House. It still then would have to pass the Senate. The clock is ticking, and so I'm not sure that they will actually get this one done. But this bill is a school voucher bill, and I think that's the best way to characterize it. And that's what it is, simply put. I'm happy to answer questions about it. But it is a school voucher bill, and I think it's important to look at the bill's proponents to know the true intent of the bill. And when you have religious organizations and certain communities of faith promoting this, I mean, the intent, and then you listen to their testimony, the intent is to create essentially a school voucher through a tax credit scholarship program. That is 2400. And then quickly, I think, just some religiously motivated pieces of legislation and other activities. There's a crisis pregnancy center resolution honoring crisis pregnancy centers. Some of them are more commonly referred to as pregnancy resource centers, and that they relied a lot in the testimony on the religious nature in which these services are being provided. And there was talk, or there is talk about diverting some state funding that way. There is a little bit of state funding that goes to those entities now, but that's something that we will be watching for in the future. We had a presentation in the Senate Public Health and Welfare Committee by a gentleman by the name of Dr. Patrick Fagan. He is the director of NARRI in Washington, D.C. I brought his full presentation with me if anyone's interested in looking at it, but it was very religious in nature. And what it boils down to is that he believes there's two models of society, the Christian model and the Planned Parenthood model. And it is all based on what promotes good economic prosperity in Kansas. And he believes that that is a marriage between a man and a woman, producing children, and that attend church regularly. The Planned Parenthood model is discouraging marriage, discouraging children, discouraging church attendance, and therefore creating dysfunction, and that leads to the economic demise of your country, of your state. So that I think was designed to educate the committee about another initiative that we saw sort of rear its head a couple of years ago in Kansas, and then with the departure of our former Secretary of SRF, it's called the Healthy Marriage Initiative. So a lot of what he is saying would provide the data and resources to promote that Healthy Marriage Initiative again. And finally, I think it's important to watch the Governor's Task Force on Childhood Poverty, and you can access that online. SRS is now called the Department of Children and Families. The task force has met twice. I keep tabs on the task force primarily from the website, but a quicker way is to follow Kansas Catholic Conference on Facebook. And they provide regular updates about what the task force is meeting on. Recently they met on family structure and what contributes to childhood poverty in terms of unwed mothers and out-of-wedlock births. But I invite you to visit that. That is where I think we'll also have some initiatives come out of in the future legislative sessions. Finally, judicial selection. For those of you that have attended the legislative forum in January that was on judicial selection, that affects pretty much every issue in Kansas. But a lot of these religious freedom issues play out in our court system. And if you allow political bias into our independent judiciary, I think that it affects the court decisions on this important issue in Kansas. But what I will finally say in terms of a legislative update, I know I've gone over time, but I think this is really important. Around these religious freedom bills, if you choose to look up how your legislator voted, you might be surprised or disappointed. But what I saw them experience this session so far was a huge response promoting some of this legislation. And that was predominantly initiated by the Kansas Catholic Conference and the Kansas Family Policy Council, and they were getting hammered with calls. And they were getting no calls on the other side. And they have to vote their district. And so I just ask you to communicate with your legislator. And I ask you to, if this issue is important to you, to engage in the future. Because in my own personal opinion, I feel that the religious freedom legislation that we are dealing with this session is only the beginning of what's to come. I would almost say it's mild in terms of what we could be seeing in the future. And it's important to know that we have a federally funded effort, not by the federal government, by a national organization, to promote religious freedom in the Kansas Capitol. And this is I'm wrapping up. But we are one of 13 states that has a funded religious freedom caucus that is looking to promote religious freedom legislation, and it is not the type of religious freedom legislation that would promote the religious freedom of all, or those that choose to not practice any faith.
Church has the freedom to refuse birth control on the basis of belief. And I'm thinking that this is specifically referring to the Roman Catholic Church response to having to provide health insurance and birth control to employees. Does church have right to impose that same belief on those of different faiths through that same refusal?
That has been one of the criticisms of the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, that religious institutions and people with certain religious convictions are going to be forced to violate their religious convictions if they have to comply with the law. We will, of course, see court decisions on this issue coming down the road, so it remains to be seen exactly how this gets parsed out. But at the present, and the Department of Health and Human Services is continuing to develop guidelines on this to try to give employers direction as to what they need to do and what they don't need to do. But in short, number one, churches are exempted from this rule. If you are a church and you have employees working for the church, you do not have to provide insurance coverage, let's say, for contraception if that violates your religious beliefs. However, if you are a church organization that operates a large hospital, and you've got, let's say, 1,000 employees, and you have people coming from the general public to avail themselves of your services, and you provide health insurance as a benefit to your employees, you're going to have to provide that, because you're no different from McDonald's, you're no different from Home Depot, you're no different from anybody else in terms of having a wide range of employees of a whole bunch of different religious beliefs, and the law now says the employer needs to provide certain basic coverage and certain benefits to their employees. So there you have it. But it does, there are some nuances that are going to have to be figured out. But it is true, that may violate your religious beliefs in some sense if you're the employer writing the check for the health insurance. But we live in a secular democracy. We live in a pluralistic society, and that's part of the price you pay by living in that kind of a world, in my view. Now, there are, you can take this to kind of its logical, absurd end, and let's say, okay, you are a Christian Scientist, and you believe that healing only comes through prayer. So the only insurance that you're going to want to provide your employees is prayer insurance. And I mean, that's just absurd. So, you know, if you think these things through a little bit, and if you're talking about an employer that's going to cover a lot of people, it puts it kind of in a different realm than it does if you are a small church and you've got 3 employees and you don't want to provide benefits because it violates your religious convictions. And I think the Affordable Care Act has tried to figure those things out, but it's still a work in progress.
Question for our panelists: how do you think the efforts to infuse Kansas legislation with religious dogma compare to what is happening elsewhere in the country?
I think Kansas may be at the tail end of the movement toward enlightenment. It seems like much of the rest of the country has moved on to accept many of the things that are kind of in the so-called progressive agenda. And Kansas is still really lagging behind, desperately holding on to a way of life that I would be willing to put money on it is going to be gone. And that may be why we're seeing what we're seeing, is that there's this desperate attempt to hold on to things by passing laws that are going to require people to pray in school and require kids to look at the picture of Jesus in the hallway, because we're afraid that they're all going to become non-believers.
which I think is just nonsense. You know, it's not going to happen like that. You're not going to convert people by doing that, and I don't think you're going to drive, you know, it's not going to have any impact. But there's a lot of, in my view, desperate moves here in Kansas to hold on to the past, and much of the rest of the country has moved on down the road. And it's a really dark time in Kansas now, in my view, because there are so many regressive things going on, so many things under the guise of freedom and liberty that are really nothing but bigotry and enshrining prejudice. And it is a very dark time. But I tell people that I'm hopeful, because you see the rest of the country moving on, and I have absolutely no doubt that it's going to happen in Kansas too. We may be the very last state out of 50, but we will be there eventually. So our task is to hang in there and fight the fight, because we'll get there.
I would just add, I agree somewhat and then I disagree somewhat, because I think some of the religious freedom legislation that we're seeing in other states could be making their way in Kansas. For example, Missouri already has a law that provides conscience protections for employers that want to refuse to pay for any coverage for any prescriptions or medication that they have a religious belief in conflict with. So that goes beyond just birth control. It's very broad. Other states have filed bills that would permit healthcare providers to refuse to perform or participate in any medical service due to a religious objection. So again, broadening those conscience protections. And then we've also seen state legislators that are considering bills that grant tax breaks to offset the fines for employers who are violating the contraception rule. And so we've seen that in Texas and in Oklahoma. That's giving for-profit businesses a tax break if they are fined for failing to offer contraception in accordance with the contraception rule. So it could be worse. In Virginia last year, we saw conscience protections for providers of foster care and adoption services. And so that specifically targets the right to parent for LGBT couples and individuals. That bill is definitely on the table in Kansas, and we've heard conversations about that bill here, which is definitely concerning for us. So I do think we are on the tail end in a lot of ways, but I think there are some states that are doing some things that I would consider to be very extreme that I believe are definitely on the table, and that in these presentations that we've seen in the legislature and some of the debates we've seen in the legislature, sort of laying the groundwork and creating that pathway for some of these other extreme pieces of legislation to make their way into Kansas.
We have two questions that I'm going to combine them a little bit because they're very closely related. The abortion question is so divisive that on many issues that it may or may not be church related, depending on how it is phrased. How do you use separation of religion and government to combat this so-called moral legislation?
If the question is asking how do you separate one's personal belief about abortion from what you do in the legislature, I'm not sure if that's the question that's being asked. But if that's the question being asked, my feeling about that is that is an extremely difficult question. I grant you that. I consider myself absolutely pro-choice. But I have a very, very good friend who is absolutely pro-life. And we have debates about this issue all the time and have agreed that we can hold fast to our separate opinions about this, but both come to agreement that regardless of what the decision is about this, the government doesn't have any business in it. Right. Period. Right. And that's where we can agree. And the problem that I see here is that there are many, many people with deep convictions opposed to abortion. And that's fine. And I have no problem with you, if you're deeply convinced of that, going around and trying to influence other people not to have an abortion. You can do that. That's your right. And that's fine. But I do not think, and this is where the line I think should be drawn, that you have the right to say, because I believe this way, I'm going to make laws in the government that are going to force every woman in this country to believe the way that I do, or maybe not believe that way, but act that way. And that's the difference. And it's you know, the moral quandaries there about abortion, I grant you that. We can have that discussion till the cows come home. But please, can we agree that it's none of the government's business, and let other people
With that, I want to thank you for taking part in our is Donna, where's Donna at? Donna, I know that you have that you would want more members of the mainstream, and we're here with you. So
Oh, I have more things than that, but I talk really fast and I won't take very long. First of all, and foremost, I want to thank all of you for coming tonight. Without you here to listen to our story, we don't have a story to tell. So you're the main thing that we're grateful for. I also want to thank the board. I'm a member of the board, so I'll thank myself and all the other members of the board for being wise enough to organize these forums, especially the planning committee, and especially our panel tonight. They were wonderful. None of these forums without the wonderful co-sponsors, Colonial Church, thank you, Reverend Robbie, and one of our best partners. We also want you to know, in case you don't, that Mainstream Coalition was founded in 1993. That makes this our 20th anniversary year. You'll be hearing more about that. But we have survived for 20 years, despite the state of the legislature right now. Imagine how bad it would be if it hadn't been for Mainstream Coalition. Our next program is on April 18th. That will be I hesitate to say, wrap-up of this legislative session. I don't know if that'll be good news or bad news. It's not hard to decide. And at that one, we'll have Representative Paul Davis, Representative Melissa Rooker, and Senator Pat Petrie. So I hope you will all put it on your calendars, come back, listen to some more wonderful information. You do have, you thought I wouldn't get to this, you do have a membership form. If there is anyone here that is not a member of the Mainstream Coalition, we encourage you to join. We would love to have you. We would love to have you have access to the great information that we have access to. The legislative summary that you got tonight, that Holly so carefully went over, you will get that if you're a member of Mainstream. And believe me, some of this legislation is pretty stealth. So without somebody actually in the legislature paying attention to what they're talking about, we don't even know what's out there until it's done. So there's no opportunity to lobby or to testify unless you know what's actually being proposed. So I can't encourage you enough to join. I hope you will. I hope you'll make our 40th anniversary an even bigger, more powerful organization.